Hi guys, reading Goblet of Fire chapter 12 today, but I wanted to show you the cover of the illustrated if you've not seen it. If you have, I'm sure you can appreciate the beauty in this. This is the sleeve over the book. It's utterly gorgeous. Anyways, thought you guys might like that. Anyways, so chapter 12, the Triwizard Tournament. Through the gates, flanked with statues and winged boars, and up the sweeping drive, the carriages trundled, swaying dangerously in what was fast becoming a gale. Leaning against the window, Harry could see Hogwarts coming nearer. Its many lightened windows blurred and shimmering behind the thick curtains of rain. Lightning flashed across the sky as their carriage came to a halt before the great oak front doors, which stood at the top of a flight of stone steps. People who had occupied the carriages in the front were already hurrying up the stone steps into the castle. Harry, Ron, Hermione, and Neville jumped down from their carriage and dashed to the steps too, looking up only when they were safely inside the cavernous, torchlit entrance hall in its magnificent marble staircase. Blimey, said Ron, shaking his head and sending water everywhere. If that keeps up, the lake's going to overflow. I'm soaked. Ack! A large red water-filled balloon had dropped from out of the ceiling onto Ron's head and exploded. Drenched and sputtering, Ron staggered sideways onto Harry just as the second water bomb dropped. Narrowly missing Hermione, it burst at Harry's feet, sending a wave of cold water over his trainers into his socks. People all around them shrieked and started pushing each other in the efforts to get out of the line of fire. Harry looked up and saw, floating 20 feet above them, Peeves, the poltergeist, a little man in a bell-covered hat and orange bow tie, his wide, malicious face contorted with concentration as he took aim again. Peeves! Yelled an angry voice. Peeves, come down here right now! Professor McGonagall, deputy headmistress of head of Hogwarts house, had come dashing out of the great hall. She skidded on the wet floor and grabbed Hermione around the neck to stop herself falling. Ouch! Sorry, Miss Granger. That's all right, Professor. Hermione gasped, massaging her throat. Peeves, get down here right now, barked Professor McGonagall, straightening her pointed hat and glaring upwards through her square-rimmed spectacles. Not doing nothing, cacked Peeves, lobbed a water bomb at several fifth-year girls, who screamed and divided into the great hall. Already wet, aren't they? Little squirts. Whee! And he aimed another water bomb at a group of second-years who had just arrived. I shall call the headmaster, said Professor McGonagall. I'm warning you, Peeves. Peeves stuck out his tongue, threw the last of the water bomb into the air, and zoomed off up the marble staircase, cackling insanely. Well, move along then, Professor said Professor McGonagall sharply to the bedraggled crowd. Into the great hall, come on. Harry, Ron, Hermione slipped and skid across the entrance hall and through the double doors on the right. Ron muttered furiously under his breath as he pushed his sopping hair out of his face. The great hall looked its usual splendid self, decorated with the start of term feast. Golden plates and goblets gleamed by the light of hundreds and hundreds of candles floating over the tables in midair. The four long house tables were packed with chattering students at the top of the hall. The staff sat along one side of the fifth table, facing their pupils. It was much warmer in here. Harry, Ron, and Hermione walked past the Slytherins, the Ravenclaws, and the Hufflepuffs, and sat down with the rest of the Gryffindors at the far side of the hall, next to nearly headless Nick, the Gryffindor ghost. Pearly white and semi-transparent, Nick was dressed tonight in his usual doubloon, with a particularly large ruff, and which served as a dual purpose for looking extra festive and ensuring that his head did not wobble too much on on his partially severed neck. Good evening, he said, beaming at them. Says who? Said Harry. taking off his trainers and emptying the water out of them. Hope they hurry up with the sorting hat. I'm starving. The sort the sorting of the new students into the houses took place at the start of every school year. But by the unlucky combination and circumstances, Harry hasn't been present at one since his own. He was quite looking forward to it. Just then, a highly excited, breathless voice called down the table, "Hiya, Harry!" It was Colin Creevy, third year boy who Harry was something of a hero. "Hi, Colin," said Harry wearily. "Harry, guess what? Guess what, Harry? My brother's starting. My brother Dennis." Good, said Harry. "He's really excited," said Colin, particularly bouncing up and down in his seat. "I just hope he's in Gryffindor. Keep your fingers crossed. Eh, Harry?" Yeah, all right, said Harry. He turned back to Hermione, Ron, and nearly headless Nick. "Brothers and sisters usually go in the same house, don't they?" he said. He was judging by the Weasleys, all seven of them, who had been put into Gryffindor. No, not necessarily," said Hermione. "Party Patil's twin is in Ravenclaw, and they're identical. You'd think they'd be together, wouldn't you?" Harry looked up at the staff table. There seemed to be rather more empty seats there than usual. Hagrid's, of course, was still fighting his way across the lake with the first years. Professor McGonagall was presumably supervising the drying of the entrance hall floor, but there was another empty chair too, and he couldn't think who else was missing. "Where's the defense against the dark art teacher?" said Hermione, who was also looking up at the teachers. They had never yet had a defense against the dark arts teacher who had lasted more than 3 terms. Harry's favorite by far has been Professor Lupin, who had resigned last year. He looked up and down the staff table. There was definitely no new face there. "Maybe they couldn't get anyone," Hermione said, looking anxious. Harry scanned the table more carefully. Tiny little Professor Flitwick, the charms teacher, was sitting in a large pile of cushions beside Professor Sprout, the herbology teacher, whose hat was askew over the flyaway gray hair. She was talking with Professor Sinistra of the astronomy department, and Professor Sinistra's other side was the sallow-faced, hook-nosed, greasy-haired potions master Snape, Harry's least favorite person at Hogwarts. Harry's loathing of Snape was matched only by Snape's hatred of him, a hatred which had, if possible, intensified last year, which Harry had helped Sirius escape right under Snape's overlarge nose. Snape and Sirius had been enemies since their own school days. Sorry, guys, my throat gets dry. On Snape's other side was an empty seat, which Harry guessed was Professor McGonagall's. Next to it, and in the very center of the table, sat Professor Dumbledore, the headmaster, his sweeping silver hair and beard shining in the candlelight, his magnificent deep green robes embroidered with many stars and moons. The tips of Dumbledore's long, thin fingers were together as he rested his chin upon them, staring up at the ceiling through his half-moon spectacles as though lost in thought. Harry glanced up at the ceiling too. It was enchanted to look like the sky outside, and he had never seen it look this stormy. Black and purple clouds were swirling across it, and another thunderclap sounded outside. A fork of lightning flashed across it. "Oh, hurry up," Ron moaned, besides Harry. "I could eat a hippogriff." The words were no longer soon out of his mouth when the doors of the great hall opened and silence fell. Professor McGonagall was leading a long line of first years up the top of the hall. If Harry, Ron, and Hermione were wet, it was nothing to how these first years looked. They appeared to have swum across the lake rather than sail. All of them were shivering, like with a combination of cold and nerves, as they filed along the staff table and came to a halt in line facing the rest of the school. All except for the smallest of the lot. A boy with mousy hair who was wrapped in what Harry recognized as Hagrid's moleskin overcoat. The coat was so big for him that it looked as though he was draped in a furry black marquee. Marquee? Mar- His small face protruded from over the collar, looking almost painfully excited. When he had lined up with his terrified looking peers, he caught Colin's eyes, gave a double thumbs up, and mouthed, "I fell in the lake." He looked positively delighted about it. Professor McGonagall now placed a three-legged stool on the ground before the first years, and on top of it an extremely old, dirty, patched wizard hat. The first year stared at it. So did everybody else. For a moment there was silence. Then a tear near the brim opened wide like a mouth, and the hat began to sing. A thousand years or more ago, when I was nearly sown, there lived four wizards of renown whose names are still well known. Bold Gryffindor from Wild Moor, fair Ravenclaw from Glen, sweet Hufflepuff from Valley, broad shrewd Slytherin from Fen. They shared a wish, a hope, a dream. They hatched a daring plan to educate young sorcerers. Thus Hogwarts School began. Now each of these four founders formed their own house for each, did value different virtues in the ones they had to teach. By Gryffindor the bravest were, prized far beyond the rest. For Ravenclaw the cleverest would always be the best. For Hufflepuff hard workers were, most worthy of admission, and power hungry Slytherins loved those of grand ambition. While still alive they did divide their favorites from the throng. Yet how to pick their worthy ones when they were dead and gone? Thus Gryffindor, who found a way, he whipped me off his head. The founders put some brains in me, so I could choose instead. Now slip me snug about your Now slip me snug upon your ears. I'd never yet been wrong. I'd have a look inside your mind and tell where you belong. The great hall rang with applause as the sorting hat finished. That's not what the song sang to us when it sorted us, said Harry, clapping along with everybody else. Sings a different song every year, said Ron. It's got to be pretty boring life, hasn't it? Being a hat. I suppose it spends all year making up a new one for the next one. Professor McGonagall was now unrolling a large scroll of parchment. When I call your name, you will put on the hat and sit on the stool, she told the first years. When the hat announces your house, you will go and sit with the appropriate table. Ackerley Stewart. A boy walked forward, visibly trembling from head to foot, picking up the sorting hat, putting it on his head, and sitting down on the stool. Ravenclaw! Shouted the hat. Stuart Ackerley took off the hat and hurried into the seat of the Ravenclaw table, where everyone was applauding him. Harry caught a glimpse of Cho and the Ravenclaw seeker, cheering Stuart Ackerley as he sat down. For a fleeting second, Harry had a strange desire to join the Ravenclaw table, too. Baddock, Malcolm, Slytherin! The table on the other side of the hall erupted with cheers. Harry could see Malfoy clapping at Baddock joined the Slytherins. Harry wondered whether Baddock knew that the Slytherin house had turned out more dark witches and wizards than any other. Fred and George hissed Malcolm Baddock as he sat down. Branstone Eleanor, Hufflepuff, Caldwell Owen, Hufflepuff, Creevy Dennis. Tiny little Dennis Creevy staggered forward, tripping over Hagrid's moleskin, just as Hagrid himself sidled into the hall through the door behind the teacher's table. About twice as tall as a normal man, and at least 3 times as broad, Hagrid, with his long, wild, tangled black hair and beard, looked slightly alarming. A misleading impression, for Harry and Ron and Hermione knew Hagrid to possess a very kind nature. He winked at them as he sat down at the end of the staff table and watched Dennis Creevy putting up his sorting hat. The rip from the brim opened wide. Gryffindor! The sorting hat shouted. Hagrid clapped along with the Gryffindors as Dennis Creevy, beaming widely, took off the hat, placed it on the back of the stool, and hurried over to join his brother. Colin, I fell in, he said shrilly, throwing himself into an empty seat. It was brilliant. and something was in the water, grabbed me, and pushed me back in the boat. Cool, said Colin, just as excitedly. It was probably the giant squid, Dennis. Wow, said Dennis, as though nobody in their wildest dreams could hope for more than being thrown into the storm tossed fathoms of the deep lake and pushed out by a giant sea monster. Dennis, see that boy down there? The one with the black hair and the glasses? See him? You know who he is, Dennis? Harry looked away, staring very hard at the sorting hat, now sorting Emma Dobbs. The sorting hat continued, boys and girls with varying degrees of fright on their faces moving one by one to the three-legged stool and a line of dwindling slowly as Professor McGonagall passed the L's. Oh, hurry up, Ron moaned, massaging his stomach. Now, Ron, the sorting hat's much more important than food, said Nearly Headless Nick, and Madly Laura became a Hufflepuff. Course it is, if you're dead, Ron snapped. I do hope this year's batch of Gryffindors are up to snatch, said Nearly Headless Nick, applauding as McDonald Natalie joined the Gryffindor table. And we don't want to break our winning streak, now do we? Gryffindor had won their inter-house championship for the past 3 years in a row. Pritchard, Graham, Slytherin, Quirk, Orla, Ravenclaw. And finally, with Whitby, Kevin, Hufflepuff, the sorting hat ended. Professor McGonagall picked up the hat and stole and carried them away. About time, said Ron, seizing his knife and fork and looking expectantly at his golden plate. Professor Dumbledore had got to his feet. He was smiling around at the students, his arms open wide in welcome. We only have 2 words to say to you, he told them, his deep voice echoing in the hall. Tuck in. Hear, hear, said Ron and Harry. As the empty dishes filled magically before their eyes, Nearly Headless Nick watched mournfully as Harry, Ron, and Hermione loaded their plates. Said Ron as his mouth was full of mashed potatoes. You're lucky there's a feast at all tonight, you know, said Nearly Headless Nick. There was trouble in the kitchens earlier. Why? What happened? Said Harry through a sizable chunk of steak. Peeves, of course, said Nearly Headless Nick, shaking his head, which wobbled dangerously. He pulled his ruffle a little higher up his neck. The usual argument, you know. He wanted to attend the feast. Well, it's quite out of the question, you know. What he's like, utterly uncivilized. Can't see a plate of food without throwing it. We held a ghost council. The fat friar was all for giving him the chance. But most wisely, in my opinion, the Bloody Baron put his foot down. The Bloody Baron was a Slytherin ghost, and gaunt and silent spectre covered in silver blood stains. He was the only person at Hogwarts who could really control Peeves. Yeah, he thought Peeves seemed hacked off about something, said Ron darkly. So what did he do in the kitchens? Oh, the usual, said Nearly Headless Nick, shrugging. Wreaked havoc and mayhem, pots and pans everywhere. Place swimming in soups terrified the house elves out of their wits. Clank! Hermione had knocked over her golden goblet. Pumpkin juice spread steadily over the tablecloth, staining several feet wide of white linen to orange. But Hermione paid no attention. There are house elves here, she said, staring horror-struck at Nearly Headless Nick. Here? At Hogwarts? Certainly, said Nearly Headless Nick, looking surprised at her reaction. The largest number on a dwelling in Britain, I believe. Over 100. I've never seen one, said Hermione. Well, they hardly ever leave the kitchen by day, do they? Said Nearly Headless Nick. They come out at night to do a bit of cleaning, see the fires and so on. I mean, you're not supposed to see them, are you? That's the mark of a good house elf, isn't it? That you don't know it's there? Hermione stared at him. But they get paid. she said. They get holidays, don't they? And sick leave and pensions and everything? Nearly headless Nick chortled so much that his ruffled slip and his head flopped off, dangling on an inch or so of ghostly skin and muscle that still attached to his neck. Sick leave and pensions, he said, pushing his head back onto his shoulders and securing it once more with his ruff. House elves don't want sick leave and pensions. Hermione looked out at her hardly touched plate of food, then put her fork and knife down upon it and pushed it away from her. Come on, Hermione, said Ron, accidentally spraying Harry with bits of Yorkshire pudding. Oops, sorry, Ari. He swallowed. You won't get them sick leave by starving yourself. Slave labor, said Hermione, breathing hard through her nose. That's what this dinner's made. That's what made this dinner. Slave labor. And she refused to eat any more bite. The rain was still drumming heavily against the high, dark windows. Another clap of thunder shook the windows, and the stormy ceiling flashed, illuminating the golden plates as the remains of the first course vanished and were replaced instantly with puddings. Treacle tart, Hermione, said Ron, deliberately wafting a smell towards her. Spotted Dick, look, chocolate gâteau, said Hermione, gave him a look so reminiscent of Professor McGonagall that he gave up. When the puddings, too, had been demolished, and the last crumbs had faded off the plates, leaving them sparkling clean, Albus Dumbledore got to his feet again. The buzz of chatter filling the hall ceased almost at once, so that only the howling wind and pounding rain could be heard. So, said Dumbledore, smiling around them all, now that we've all been fed and watered, said Hermione, I must once more ask for your attention while I give out a few notices. Mr. Filch, the caretaker, has asked me to tell you that the list of objects forbidden inside the castle has this year been extended to include screaming yogos, fanged frisbees, and ever-bashing boomerangs. The full list comprises some 437 items, I believe, and can be viewed on Mr. Filch's office if anybody would like to check it. The corners of Dumbledore's mouth twitched. He continued, as ever, I would like to remind you all that the forest and the grounds is out of bounds to students, as is the village of Hogsmeade to all below third year. It is also my painful duty to inform you that the Inter-House Quidditch Cup will not take place this year. What? Harry gasped as he looked at Fred and George, his fellow members of the Quidditch team. They were mouthing soundlessly as Dumbledore, apparently too appalled to speak. Dumbledore continued, this is due to an event that will be starting in October and continuing throughout the school year, taking up much of our teachers' time and energy. But I assure you, you will all enjoy it immensely. My goodness. I have great pleasure in announcing that this year at Hogwarts. But at that moment there was a deafening rumble of thunder, and the doors of the great hall banged open. A man stood in the doorway, leaning upon a long staff shrouded in a black traveling cloak. Every head in the great hall swiveled towards the stranger, suddenly brightly illuminated by a fork of lightning that flashed across the ceiling. He lowered his hood, shook out his long mane of grizzled dark gray hair, then began to walk up towards the teacher's table. A dull clunk echoed through the halls as every other step. He reached the end of the top table, turned right, limped heavily towards Dumbledore. Another flash of lightning crossed the ceiling. Hermione gasped. The lightning had thrown the man's face into sharp relief, and his face was unlike Harry had ever seen. It looked as though it had been carved out of weathered wood by someone who had only the vaguest idea of what a human face is supposed to look like, and was none too skilled with a chisel. Every inch of skin seemed to be scarred. His mouth looked like a diagonal gash, and a large chunk of his nose was missing. But it was a man's eyes that made him frightening. One of them was small, dark, and beady, and the other was large, round as a coin, and vivid electric blue. The blue eye was moving ceaselessly without blinking, and was rolling up and down from side to side, quite independently from a normal eye. And then it rolled right over, pointing to the back of the man's head, so that all they could see was whiteness. The stranger reached Dumbledore. He stretched out his hand that was as badly scarred as his face, and Dumbledore shook it, muttering words Harry couldn't hear. He seemed to be making some inquiry on the stranger, who shook his head unsmilingly and replied in an undertone. Dumbledore nodded and gestured the man to an empty seat at the right-hand side. The stranger sat down, shook his mane of dark gray hair out of his face, pulled a plate of sausages towards him, raised it to what was left of his nose, and sniffed it. Then he took a small knife out of his pocket, speared a sausage at the end of it, and began to eat. His normal eye was fixed upon the sausage, but his blue eye was still darting restlessly around in its socket, taking in the hall and the students. "May I introduce to you our new Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher," said Dumbledore brightly into the silence. "Professor Moody." It was usual for new staff members to be greeted with applause, but none of the staff nor students clapped except for Dumbledore and Hagrid. Both of them put their hands together, applauded, but the sound echoed dismally in the silence, and they stopped fairly quickly. Everybody else seemed too transfixed by Moody's bizarre appearance to do much more than stare at him. "Moody?" Harry muttered to Ron. "Mad-Eye Moody? The one your dad went to go help this morning?" "Must be," said Ron in a low, awed voice. "What happened to him?" Hermione whispered. "What happened to his face?" "Don't know," said Ron, whispered back, watching Moody with fascination. Moody seemed totally indifferent to his less than warm welcome. Ignoring the jug of pumpkin juice in front of him, he reached again into the traveling cloak, pulled out his hip flask, and took a long draught from it. As he lifted his arm to drink, his cloak was pulled a few inches from the ground, and Harry saw below the table several inches of a carved wooden leg, ending in a clawed foot. Dumbledore cleared his throat. "Wow, so did I." "As I was saying," he said, smiling at a sea of students before him, all of whom were still gazing transfixed at Mad-Eye Moody, "we are to have the honor of hosting a very exciting event over the coming months. An event which has been not held for over a century. It is my very great pleasure to inform you that the Tri-Wizard Tournament will be taking place at Hogwarts this year." "You're joking," said Fred Weasley loudly. The tension that had filled the hall since Moody's arrival suddenly broke. Nearly everyone laughed. Dumbledore chuckled appreciatively. "I'm not joking, Mr. Weasley," he said. "Though, now that you mention it, I did hear an excellent one over the summer about a troll and a hag and a leprechaun who all go into this bar." Professor McGonagall cleared her throat loudly. But maybe this is not the time." "No," said Dumbledore. "Where was I? Yes, Triwizard Tournament. Well, some of you will not know what the tournament involves, so I hope those who do will forgive me for giving a short explanation and allow their attention to wander freely." The Triwizard Tournament was first established some 700 years ago as a friendly competition between three largest European schools of wizardry: Hogwarts, Beauxbatons, and Durmstrang. I always have a hard time saying that word. A champion was selected to represent each school, and the three champions competed in three magical tasks. The school took in turns to host the tournament every 5 years, and it has generally agreed to be the most excellent way of establishing ties between young witches and wizards of different nationalities, until, that is, the death toll mounted so high that the tournament was discontinued. Death toll, said Hermione, whispered, looking alarmed, but her anxiety did not seem to be shared by the majority of the students of the hall. Many of them were whispering excitedly with each other, and Harry himself was far more interested in hearing more about the tournament than the worrying about the deaths that had happened hundreds of years ago. There had been several attempts over the centuries to reinstate the tournament, Dumbledore continued, none of which have been very successful. However, our own departments of international magical cooperation and magical games and sports have decided this time is ripe for another attempt. We have worked hard over the summer to ensure that, this time, no champion will find himself or herself in mortal danger. The heads of Beauxbatons and Drumstring, my goodness, will be arriving with their short-listed contenders in October, and a selection of the three champions will take place at Halloween. An impartial judge will decide which students are most worthy to compete for the Triwizard Cup, the glory of their school, and 1,000 galleons personal prize money. I'm going for it, said Fred Weasley, hissed down the table, his face lit with enthusiasm at the prospect of such glory and riches. He was not the only person who seemed to be visualizing himself a Hogwarts champion. At every house table, Harry could see people either gazing raptly at Dumbledore or else whispering fervently to their neighbors. But then Dumbledore spoke again, and the hall quieted once more. Eager though I know all of you will be to bring Triwizard Cup to Hogwarts, he said, the heads of the participating schools, along with the Ministry of Magic, have agreed to impose an age restriction on contenders this year. Only students who are of age, that is to say, 17 years or older, will be allowed to put forward their names for consideration. This Dumbledore raised his voice slightly, for several people had made noises of outrage at these words, and the Weasley twins were suddenly looking furious. Is it a measure to It is a measure we feel it is necessary, given the tournament tasks will still be difficult and dangerous, whatever precautions we take, and it is highly unlikely that the students below 6th or 7th year will be able to cope with them. I will personally be ensuring that no underage students hoodwinks our impartial judge into making them Hogwarts champions. His light blue eyes twinkled as they flickered over Fred and George, mutinous faces. I therefore beg you not to waste your time submitting yourself if you are under the age of 17. The delegations for Beauxbatons and Drumstring will be arriving in October and will be remaining with us for the greater part of this year. I know that you will be all extend every courtesy to our foreign guests while they are with us, and we will give your wholehearted support to the Hogwarts champions when he or she is selected. And now, it is late, and I know how important it is to you to be alert and rested as you enter your lessons tomorrow morning. Bedtime. Chop chop. Dumbledore sat down again, turned to talk to Mad-Eye Moody. There was a great scraping and banging sound as all the students got to their feet, swarming towards the double doors into the entrance hall. They can't do that, said George Weasley, who had not joined the crowd moving forward to the door, but was standing up, glaring at Dumbledore. We're 17 in April. Why can't we have a shot? They're not stopping me entering, said Fred stubbornly. He's scowling at the top of the table. The champion will get to do all sorts of stuff you'd never be allowed to do normally. And 1,000 galleon prize money? Yeah, said Ron, a faraway look across his face. Yeah, 1,000 galleons. Come on, said Hermione. We'll be the only ones left here if you don't move. Harry, Ron, Hermione, Fred, George set off to the entrance hall. Fred and George debated the ways in which Dumbledore might stop those who were under the age of 17 from entering the tournament. Who's this impartial judge who's going to decide the champions are? Said Harry. Don't know, said Fred. But but it's them we have to fool, I reckon. A couple of drops of aging potion might do, George. Dumbledore knows you're not of age, though, said Ron. Yeah, but he's not the one who decides who the champions is he? Said Fred shrewdly. Sounds to me like once the judge knows who wants to enter, he'll choose the best one for the school. And never mind how old they are. Dumbledore's trying to stop us giving our names. People have died, though, said Hermione in a worried voice as they walked through the door, concealed behind a tapestry, and stared up another narrower staircase. Yeah, said Fred airily. But that was years ago, wasn't it? Anyway, where's the fun without a bit of risk? Hey, Ron, what if we find out how to get around Dumbledore? Fancy entering? What, do you reckon? Ron asked Harry. Be cool to enter, wouldn't you? Bet I suppose they might want someone older. Don't know if we've learned enough. I definitely haven't, came Neville's gloomy voice from behind Fred and George. I expect my gran want me to try, though. She's always going on about how I should be upholding the family honor. I'll just have to... Oops! Neville's foot got stuck right through the step halfway up the staircase. There are many tricks of the stairs at Hogwarts. It's second nature to most of the older students to jump this particular step, but Neville's memory was notoriously poor. Harry and Ron seized him under the armpits and pulled him out, while a suit of armor at the top of the stairs creaked and clanked, loudly wheezing. Shut it, you, said Ron, banging down the visor as he passed. They made their way up to the entrance to the Gryffindor Tower, which was concealed behind a large portrait of the fat lady in a pink silk dress. Password? She said as they approached. Balderdash, said George, a prefect told me downstairs. The portrait swung forward to reveal a hole in the wall through which they all climbed. A crackling fire was warming the circular common room, which was full of squashy armchairs and tables. Hermione cast a merrily dancing flame. Hermione cast a merrily dancing flames a dark look, and Harry distinctly heard her muttering, "Slave labor," before bidding them good night and disappearing through the doorways to the girls' dormitories. I love Hermione. Harry, Ron, and Neville climbed up the last spiral staircase until they reached their own dormitory, which was suited to the top of the tower. 5 four-poster beds with deep crimson hangings stood against the walls, with each its owner's trunk at the foot. Dean and Seamus, I almost forgot his name, were already getting into bed. Seamus had pinned his Ireland rosette to the headboard, and Dean had tacked up a poster of Viktor Krum over his bedside table. The old poster of West's hand football item was pinned right next to it. Mental, Ron sighed, shaking his head as completely stationary soccer players. Harry, Ron, and Neville got into their pajamas and into bed. Someone, a house elf, no doubt, had placed warming pans between the sheets and was extremely comfortable, lying there in bed and listening to the storm raging outside. I might go for it, you know, Ron said, sleeping through the darkness. If Fred and George find out how to, the tournament. You never know, do ya? Suppose not. Harry rolled over in his bed, a series of dazzling new pictures forming in his mind's eye. He had hoodwinked the impartial judges into believing he was 17. He'd become Hogwarts champion. He was standing in the grounds with his arm raised in triumph in front of the whole school, all of whom were applauding and screaming. He had just won the Triwizard Tournament. Cho's face stood out particularly clearly in a blurred crowd, her face glowing with admiration. Harry grinned into his pillow, exceptionally glad that Ron couldn't see what he could. Have a good night, guys.